our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. Thank you all for tuning in. Town Hall is proud to be a community-focused organization and a place where we can share and sustain ideas and creativity, even if it means we can't gather in person. I'd like to thank Kathleen and Sharon for appearing tonight to help make that possible. Town Hall will be continuing to produce virtual content this fall, and many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form on our digital media library. Check out our online calendar to see what's still to come this season at townhallseattle.org. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include performances as part of this year's Earshot Jazz Festival, the first feature presentation of Joshua Roman's residency for Mata, Fenton Johnson with Diane April about solitude and creative life, and more. Town Hall and the nonprofit community at large have been put under significant strain due to the ever-changing landscape. We hope you will consider extending your generosity to help support us during this difficult time by making a donation by clicking on the donate button at the bottom of your screen or becoming a member. Our partner booksellers have been hit by the negative effects of the COVID outbreak and can use your support as well. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of the book being presented tonight, please use the link on this live stream page to purchase through Elliott Bay Books. For viewers who want to watch this broadcast with closed captioning, we recommend viewing the stream via our YouTube page. To enable real-time closed captioning, click the CC button at the bottom right corner of the video player. The video will be available for rewatching immediately following tonight's broadcast. Tonight's presentation will be about 60 minutes, including Q&A. Kathleen and Sharon will select questions from those submitted in the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen. We will also take questions from the YouTube chat. We cannot guarantee that we'll be able to address every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. Please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Arts and Culture series is supported by For Culture, Arts Fund, Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, and Wyncote Foundation Northwest. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members watching tonight. Kathleen Flenniken is a local poet and educator in Seattle. She is the recipient of a Pushcart Prize and fellowship from the National Endowment of the Arts and Artist Trust. She served as Washington Poet Laureate from 2012 to 2014. She teaches poetry in schools through arts agencies like Writers in Schools and Jack Straw. She also serves on the board of Jack Straw, an audio arts studio and cultural center. She won the Washington State Book Award for her poetry collection, Plume, published in 2012, which is a meditation on the Hanford nuclear site and her hometown of Richland, Washington. Her first book, Famous, won the Prairie Schooner Book Prize in poetry and was named a notable book by the American Library Association. Sharon Bryan is a Seattle-based author and educator who has written 4 books of poems, most recently Sharp Stars, which won the Isabel Stewart Garner Poetry Award, and Flying Blind. She also edited Where We Stand, Women Poets on Literary Tradition, and co-edited with William Olson, Planet on the Table, Poets on the Reading Life. Her awards include 2 NEA fellowships in poetry and a Governor's Award from the state of Washington. Flenniken's poetry collection, Post-Romantic, is the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Kathleen Flenniken and Sharon Bryan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. I want to say thank you to Town Hall for hosting us tonight. This is such a strange time to be trying to launch a book, so it's really great to have this support. And I want to say thank you to University of Washington Press for the beautiful job they did on my new book, Post-Romantic, which is so beautiful. Whatever you might think about what it contains, you will not be able to argue about what a beautiful object it is. I want to say thank you too to Linda Beards, who selected the book for the poetry, the Northwest Poetry Series. And she was just a great editor for me. She helped me make it a better book. So I'm very grateful for that. I want to say thanks to all my first readers and writing friends that have made their mark on some of these poems. And I want to say a big thank you to Sharon Bryan for sharing this evening with me. And I wanted to start the evening just by introducing Sharon by telling you a little bit about how we met. So
Yes,
about 20 years ago, I think it was 19 years ago, 2001, I looked on my bookshelf and I was thinking, I want to try to take my writing to the next level. And I wasn't sure how to do that, but I thought that I needed a teacher for that. And I looked on my bookshelf, which wasn't as elaborate as my bookshelves now. That's many, many years of collecting poetry behind me. I made of that 3 or 4 shelves of poetry at that point. And I pulled down Flying Blind, which is a book I had loved, and sort of paged through it again. And, it's just such an amazing book. It's so smart and soulful and it's so well crafted. And I just thought, this is a person who I could imagine learning from. So even though I didn't know Sharon from Adam, through the magic of the internet, I looked her up, found her email address, and I wrote to her. And I thought she was actually in Kalamazoo at the time. And I wrote to her and asked if she would take a private student. And it turned out she was actually living in Port Townsend, just a couple of hours away. And she called, we started talking, and we've never stopped talking since. And and I can't think of a better person to talk to about poetry. I mean, Sharon, you're just such a passionate reader and writer, and your poems have meant so much to me. You've been so important in mine, in taking them seriously from the very beginning. It's just been essential to me. So who better to share this evening with than you? So thank you for joining me.
It's a huge pleasure to just, and you're right, we've been talking since then.
We have.
One of those wonderful serendipitous things that to be close together, not to just be working by mail and then to meet and to go keep the conversation going. And I, of course, have learned as much from you as you have from me. So it's just, this is a huge pleasure.
Well, thanks for being here. So obviously we're here to talk about post-romantic. I'm very excited.
Me too.
This is the first book to come out in 8 years for me. So I'm very slow to write a poem and very slow to write a book. So one of the things I want to do, sort of set the stage, is to talk about how, my first book was famous. It was about domestic life, really. And I don't mean that in a diminishing way at all. It's just, I was writing about my life, which was at home with children. My parents were passing away. I was starting to read poems, so that made its way into the book. So in that world, I was thinking about trying to make something larger out of a small life. And then in my second book, I was working with Plume, which is about the Hanford nuclear site, about growing up next to it, working there, and then sort of finding out about it was a little bit about identity, actually, about understanding who I was in the shadow of this Hanford nuclear site. And in that project, I feel like I was really taking something huge and trying to make it human scale. So with this book, I'm still learning how to articulate it, but I really am thinking about both. There's poems about marriage and about family here. There's also poems about ecological upheaval, about nuclear issues. There's poems about America and love of country and about the world. And I'm trying to kind of work with all of them. And that's been sort of what I've had in mind, and it's been a real challenge, which is one of the reasons it's taken me so long to finish it.
Can I step in now and start talking?
Please.
Or do you want to say more about this?
No, I want you to step in.
I told Kathleen when I have a book, I start at the beginning with getting into it. I don't just usually open it up, even a book of poetry. But of course, with this one, I stopped with this amazing cover. It's when you see it up close, it's a lot of little squares and rectangles, a lot of different pale colors. And then as you look at them, you realize they're little glimpses of corners of rooms or a woman several different images of a woman and an arm with a wristwatch. And for me, it seems so related to the book because it feels like an image of how memory works. That there's all this kind of blurry vagueness. And then out of that, these little bits stick with us and they make their way into poems like they do in yours. I'm also interested that they're by the cover art's by a Seattle artist named I'm just looking.
Joe Redco.
Joe Redco. I love his work. I looked it up online. This was in an exhibit called Tiny Mirrors, and one description of it says it's as if it connects the viewer and the artist. It's like the past and the present. The past is looking at you in the present, and I really like that. And I think it's related to the poems in post-romantic.
Yeah, I didn't even select that cover. That was Christina Noble at UW Press found that and used it, which I thought was just amazing. The minute I saw it, I thought that's a fantastic fit. Yep. And that feeling, the disjointedness too of it, that there's little pieces. And that's one of the ways I was trying to arrange these poems. The book is all one section. For those of you who are interested in the way books are arranged, I decided not to have sections, and the poems move between the intimate and the large scale. So you might have a poem about reading a child to sleep, and then that's next to a poem about Chernobyl. And there are little hooks between each of the poems, but they're not always very visible. So that was one of the things I had in mind as I arranged the book.
What is the cover seems very, it's all, the way it's broken up seems to me like an image of like postmodernism. Things are broken up. They aren't linear. They aren't a linear narrative. How did you choose the title?
The title came very early. I had this very early idea about family, marriage, and America. And I wanted to somehow bring them together, and I didn't know how I was going to do that. And I really, really struggled with that. But I had this title, post-romantic, to sort of go over the top of it. And the title for me really helped me keep going, even when I sort of was feeling very frustrated that I didn't know how to solve this problem.
Interesting.
And and this idea of, we think about a marriage and how marriage, we all know on some level that your marriage moves from a romantic relationship to something deeper. And
if it's going to last,
if it's going to last, that's a known thing about marriage. And it's the advice that people pass on to each other. It's one thing to know that intellectually. It's a very different thing to actually live it and to live through that. And it can be very hard. And so I like that idea of the post-romantic to cover
really hard
the marriage.
With the country. Really hard with the country.
Yeah, and I have felt that my relationship with America was so simple-minded, in part because of the language we're given for patriotism is so simple-minded. And so that idea of moving past that simple idea about America into something far more complicated, I think. Yeah.
I think that I really like the epigraph for the book, which I think of as a sort of introduction, but it's surprising to me what he says. It's a quote from Rilke's Duino Elegies, and he says, "Isn't it time that our loving freed us from the one we love?"
And that's what I love about it. It's so slippery. Yes. you try to understand it, but you can't quite. It's impossible to paraphrase.
Yes, absolutely.
It resists you, and what it's pulled from this book, the Duino Elegies, which about 5 years ago I discovered a particular translation of it by Tavern Books, a translation by Gary Miranda, which I just read over and over and over. And then that led me to some other more maybe conventional translations of it. But it was so, it didn't feel like a translated poem. It felt so alive. And I felt as I was reading these poems, it was very different than any other reading experience I've had. I wasn't exactly sure what I was looking for in it, but I just kept reading for answers. I didn't know what the questions were in some ways. But I felt like there was lessons in that set of poems. And it's so tenderhearted and it's so kind that I felt very troubled about the time that we're living in. I think it gave me support in a way. So when I started writing, many of these poems are really influenced by that reading of Duino elegies over and over again. And maybe what I'll do is begin with one of the very early poems, which is called Letter to Rilke. And it's a long poem. I think it's 9 sections, something like that. I'm only going to read 3 sections. This is a poem that really resisted me. I wanted to write about this memory I had from childhood of our family traveling along the Columbia Gorge between my home of Richland, Washington, and Portland and Hood River, Oregon, where our family lived, where we would go visit our aunts and uncles. And so I was trying to take that memory and impose on it this feeling I have for a lost America. And I'm not being purely nostalgic about that. I understand the complications of that old America and how it's not all just and it's not all good. But still, there is something in me that misses something that's gone. And one of the things I thought about is how the Columbia Gorge was created by the Missoula floods. But we didn't know when I was a child about the Missoula floods. That wasn't determined until later. And so what we didn't know, we couldn't see. So that's kind of where this poem begins. So I'm going to read section 1 and 4 and 5. Letter to Rilke, November 2016. I'm remembering a Western scene. I was a child, sticky hot between my brothers in the backseat of a Buick doing 80 down a 2-lane highway. The desert gaped like the shed shell of some giant writhing thing. The truth was just as alien. Basalt plateaus and canyons carved 15,000 years ago by cataclysmic floods. But the floods were still an arcane, discredited theory. And because we didn't know, we couldn't see. We skittered across the massive landscape, completely ignorant, inhaling my father's cigar smoke. And then later on, motel postcards showed a bowl of sky tinged with green, a generous cocktail of leaded gas and low-level radiation. To you, and this is addressed to Rilke, to you, this is America's future, a star sapphire, a weird and worldly blue with a burst of light inside. But to me, it's an irretrievable past. The man in his car was the best of us. That's almost true. He populated this nation, decent, hardworking. You'd say his streaming Godhead inciting the night to infinite uproar. His Godhead by day only nudging the surface. Head cocked, hat, shoulders back. He'd been a soldier. Killing men brought no relief, and he never spoke of it. America has always been defined by haunted men and women, but this one bore an extra burden, our newfound power to kill everything. I remember a motel I always looked for, pitched on the bluff over a hydroelectric dam, centipedal warrens, each with closed drapes and orange doors. Transmission towers marched up the hills through the sagebrush, and the dam was lit at night like a prison. Along with that neon sign, motel, it was the only consequential light in town. The drapes stayed closed. I'm trying to marry then and now. Dear Rilke, I enter one of those rooms, slide in beside the man, and see him no better for our nakedness. How uneasily I love America.
That seems like a kind of perfect lead into me to how a poem that I love about how early we get those impressions of what that sort of upwelling of patriotism without even understanding it.
Yes,
Do you want to read A Child's Book of America?
absolutely. And one of the things I think is interesting is this is a book I had as a child. It was called My Prayers. So it's about Christian, being a good Christian child. But since my parents never read it to me, I just looked at the pictures, and the pictures were a different message. The pictures were about America. So, A Child's Book of America. By the time I could read its title, My Prayers, I'd already learned religion from my favorite illustration inside, a blonde girl gazing from a hilltop at her American town below. American because of the white church and wide streets, and because under the gabled roofs, the artist implied garden rakes and comfortable rooms pungent with furniture wax and clocks that chimed, and in the kitchen, butter on a dish, and in the closet, a button jar and dozens of bright spools of thread. I resolved to be just the same, blonde, with a clock in the hall, and a father who came home to dinner served in clouds of steam. I learned America is a religion, and praying feels like envy. The spirit has moved me again and again.
That just seems like a terrific melding of that. And I mean, I remember singing as a child in school with my hand over my heart, some of
Exactly.
the pay, and it's a powerful emotion, but you have no idea what it means or what it translates into. I don't quite understand. And that just seems like a perfect image of it.
Thank you. Yeah, that it is. It's very mysterious. Looking back and trying to understand the beginnings of those strong feelings, and I still feel now. I feel kind of like a sucker. I feel
Yes.
so often. I feel that I have these sort of knee-jerk feelings of love of country that I have hard time understanding or controlling,
Yes.
and I'm getting better at controlling them, but. This is trying to make sense of those beginnings.
I think another piece of that, of loving your country, and that it's then getting angry at it and being baffled by it, the way you did in what you wrote about Plume. I mean, how can a country you love behave so badly?
Yes.
And what are we, and treat a lot of its citizens so we seem to have utter disregard for lives and
having to remember and remind myself again and again that we are our country. We are.
I know. We the people
do it to
right?
ourselves.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Yes.
But but it doesn't feel like that so often. It feels like something imposed and coming from the outside. So which makes us helpless. Do you want to read Fukushima 50?
Yes. So another thread that's running through the book are these poems from the world. Some of them are, a number of them are about environmental issues, disasters. So the Fukushima 50 were the people that famously stayed back behind in the Daiichi plant after the tsunami, and who tried to get things under control. And this poem is in two voices, which wind back and forth. One of the voices is sort of like the voice of the survivors, the people who had to leave their homes. And then the other voice is really more the voice of a myth being made. So those kind of go back and forth. And the poem begins with 2 epigraphs. The first is from the BBC. In fact, there were never 50 of them. Hundreds of workers stayed at the plant, braving high levels of radiation to bring the reactors under control. Many are still there today. And then the second epigraph is from a Fukushima survivor. They are not heroes for us. In fact, there were 5 who remained, each too ancient and repentant to be killed by radiation. The first suffered an ocean of cold, dark, and wet without complaint. They lived and toiled on 1 biscuit baked into stone, 1 sip of water each, in oven temperatures, renouncing sleep. The second built a moat of ice to contain the radiation. They worked unseen while the rest of us camped on gym floors and dreamed, eyes fluttering, emitting whines, while our feet twitched as if running through poisoned orchards. The third plucked every green thing and blew it clean before replanting it. We turned our backs on the Daiichi plant to watch our laundry on the line decay. The fourth collected sickness in his pockets. We read the dangerous grass like the wet tip of an official's pen and waited for an explanation. The fifth built a temple out of our shunning.
I guess this poem really makes me think about that notion, do you love your country enough to die for it? I mean,
Yes.
because of my age, I've never had, my brothers were both in danger of the draft during the Vietnam War, and that was the first time I thought, I don't even have to think about this. And they could, it's life and death for them. And
Exactly.
I'm not sure there's a situation, I don't know that I might love my country that much. People maybe, but I can't imagine myself putting myself in the position they did.
Yes, and then the Western take on it is that of course they'll be made into heroes, but they weren't heroes.
Right.
So I think that's very interesting too.
I know that epigraph is fascinating to me. It's sort of like, it's as mysterious as the epigraph for the book. That just keeps thinking. Another poem that I really like that deals with, I mean, presumably if we love the country, then we love the world, and we treat the world pretty horribly. And again, I don't know how to deal with that. I find it incredibly painful. I think a lot of us do. We're doing to this beautiful planet that we live on. I remember first reading Seven Seas quite a while. It seems like it's one of the earlier poems for this book, isn't it?
It's not one of the earliest, but it's definitely one that took me a long time to write. You saw a very early version of it. It was one I really just kept pounding away on. It's called Seven Seas. The one we fish to death, that tosses ships till they sink. So deep the fish at the fissures squiggle instead of swim, glow instead of gaze. The one inside a conch shell that sweeps us from the couch to its shore, our first metaphor. The sea of ones and zeros with tributaries pressing send, where our secrets glitter in the data gyre. The sea of refugees turned away, turned away, turned away, crashing the razor wire fence. The sea of cash, thick with trawlers tangling nets, green with the drowned and drowning. The sea of regret that surges and retreats and sucks at our feet, a tide that takes us nowhere. And the final sea of liquid light we'll only know from below.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, that's painful. I mean, it is, and it should be. And I love it that you used that form, that you took the seven seas, which is this sort of mythical storied shape, and then made it into something contemporary. I really like, so it has all kinds of resonance. I want to ask you a question just about timing, because I know we want to get to the poems about the heart, not heart, maybe the heart, the ground of the book is these marriage and family love poems. And I'm just keeping an eye on the clock.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's switch to that.
Yeah, I want to make sure there's time for those.
Yeah, let's do that. So I do have, I would say the poem is really grounded in the poems about marriage.
The book.
Yes, the book. And long marriage. This is a marriage, you know, of 30 plus years. So I thought I'd start with this. Several of these poems are actually longer than these poems are longer than what I've written in the past. And many of them are linked vignettes. And in this particular poem that I'm starting with is called Night Train from Salzburg. And it goes back and forth between the present and a memory of a night train that my husband and I took before we were married. So like 35 years ago now. And we got on in Salzburg and we took the train. We rode in couchettes and we landed in Switzerland, arrived in Switzerland. And so it's this, and I didn't sleep hardly any at all that night. And my husband doesn't remember it at all. And I remember it so well. I remember it as though it was yesterday. And I have always felt secretly that there was something key about that night that was important to why we ended up together. So I'm only going to read one tiny section of that poem. And it's actually set in present day, but it's a kind of meditation on long marriage. Long marriage is predicted by patterns of call and response. One sees a goldfinch out the window and comments. The other responds with an interested, "Oh." One suggests an article in the newspaper and the other is pleased because she missed it and says so. Not passions, the experts say. No probing each other's depths. Not probing each other's depths. Just human birdsong.
I really love that.
The next poem, again, I'm just going to read 3 of 7 sections. It's called Pillow Talk, and all of the vignettes take place either in sleep or in bed. 1. Of all their not talking, mornings are their favorite. He hears her eyelids flutter. She feels his long limbs still. And the exchange of atoms, which is the feature of old married couples, the continuity of years, rolling landscape, and a sky too large to face. What did you dream? He doesn't ask. And she doesn't answer about the attic shops, the basement portal into an unfamiliar backyard. Every night they spend side by side, wading through their private sleep symbols, their X's and O's. One rises first, and their separate lives begin in independent 3-point planes. On their best days, they intersect. Some mornings she feels him washed up on her beach, not saying anything. 6. The sound of him turning a page became the sound of pressing a button, and the sound of his breathing became more pronounced, trudging up a steeper and steeper hill, shouldering a backpack full of rocks. And I should note before section 7, there has been a section that describes children. So this last section, the TV blaring downstairs, laughter, refrigerator opening and closing, bare feet up the stairs and into the lit hallway. A voice calls softly through their closed door, as though they were one person. So I'm fascinated by the way a marriage feels on the inside versus the way it looks on the outside. And even in my experience of watching my parents and feeling so intimately a part of their marriage is still different than the story my father told me about their marriage after my mother died.
Wow.
And I had always thought that they were equally private, but it turned out that my mother was the private one, and my dad wanted to share some of that marriage with me. And it, you know, it's just so interesting. You're right next to a marriage, but you don't understand it if you're not in it. So, oh, one last poem, and then we can probably take questions. Although I'm saving one last poem for
Yes.
the end. This is called With Seagulls. And you can picture Ivor's fish and chips bar outside with seagulls. The wind today contains some errant sea breeze, redolent of the 5th day of our honeymoon, when we bought a pail and shovel at a hardware store. I'm pondering the sci-fi novel you described over fish and chips, barely mentioning the characters, since love and human frailty are secondary to black hole transport and the problems of colonizing the ring around a moon. Then you segued to the data center at work, and my mind defragged for a while. In one of the chambers of your heart, a seagull is always riding a thermal, genius of the physics of the wing. In my family growing up, seagulls were considered rude opportunists with vacant looks and dirty minds. I forget for years at a time how far you and I have traveled. Then a seagull drops down for a French fry, and there you are, holding so still. The transaction between you is personal and delicate, like when two married people start liking each other again.
That's so beautiful. That's one of my favorite poems in the book.
Thank you.
I mean, because I think I mean, it's partly fascinating to me because I've never had a long marriage, and it's too late now, you know. But
Yeah.
and and it is so different from the romance that burns off like alcohol, and
It's a good way to put it.
Whole different kind of work. And I have other friends, you know, my friends John and Gloria, and I have other friends in very long marriages, and they're fascinating to me to see what they're really. They're all very different, but partnerships in a way.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think how is that like in different love of country?
Mm. Well, I feel like we're given language for marriage, and there's more room for the daily ups and downs. You know, that's a hard question.
Well, I mean, it just occurred to me. Yeah, go ahead. No, you go ahead. I asked you. I just think that I can see. I mean, they feel different to me. And I think what you just started to say, I'm thinking about that early poem about the child.
Yes.
And that we have that, but don't we get a similar version of that about romantic love?
Yes, I do think that what we're handed in terms of this is how you love your country is very much like this is Cinderella and this is how you love your prince. And we somehow have never really provided a path towards a much more nuanced version of how to love our country. And I think how we love our country looks a lot like what Portland looked like this spring, unfortunately.
Right.
There's a lot of pent up emotion, and it's very hard to get it out. And we are voting. That's one way to get it out. But there's so much out of our control.
Yeah. And if you, can you have a marriage or love of country if without the truth? And I think we've so long not told the truth to ourselves about, we just live with the Cinderella version of America.
That's exactly right.
It's never going to work as a marriage, until we tell the truth.
I mean, we lied to ourselves on the floors of Congress. They're telling everybody we're, the best, we have the best health care in the world, and we're the most democratic nation. And none of those things are true.
No. Yeah.
Just because you want it to be true doesn't make it true.
Yeah. So it seems really similar in that way when you keep telling yourself about a person.
Yeah.
Those lies.
Should we look at a couple questions, maybe?
Yes. Okay. Ooh, a bunch of interesting. Okay. Here's one from Gary Brown. Kathleen, you talked a bit about the cover of Post-Romantic. Can you talk about the cover of Famous, which has always intrigued me? What meaning does the cover of Famous have for you?
So I've been very fortunate because all three of my books were produced by university presses that had in-house design, which in this day and age is a rare thing. And in fact, in all three cases, I didn't have all that much control over the final image. So in that case, they just said, here's your cover. But they had a really good design sense at University of Nebraska at the time. And I love the image. It's just an image of like Christmas lights strung across a kitchen. And the lights are so tiny. And it's such a minor little celebration in this house that I thought that was perfect. And one of the things that got said over and over again about Famous, which really kind of was a drag after a while, was how modest it was. The speaker is so modest. And I thought the cover was wonderfully modest, but playful at the same time.
Yeah.
And that was a great fit.
That's funny. I thought it was wonderfully audacious to call it Famous. That didn't seem modest to me at all. Even if there was some irony. Okay, here's one from Stephen Ross. As a writer, how do you approach the relationship between your memory, history, and your current view of long ago events? That's really interesting.
Read it to me one more time.
As a writer, how do you approach the relationship between your memory, history, and your current view of long ago events?
How is my memory different than my current view of long ago events? I'm not sure how that's different. But what I would say is that all I have is my own, the only thing why should anybody read one of my poems except maybe I have an experience that I can share with you that means something to me. So I try to make my poems, it's my nature to make the poems personal. I do like to write about history, but I like to write about it through the lens of my own experience. It's the only way I know how to make it matter to me. And I don't think a poem, unless it matters to me, it's not going to matter to anybody else.
I'm thinking about the part of that question that says your memory and your current view of long ago events, because when I know that for me, I have a lot of memories, but then when I think about them now, and they've surely changed over time since memory isn't instant replay. But when I look at them now, I often have a different understanding of them, of what was
That's a great point. That's a great point. And I love that complexity. That's what I'm always looking for. That's what inspires me to write, is that idea of something not being clear cut. So looking back at a very innocent time through eyes that are not so innocent, I think is what gives it some meat, and gives it some
Which is
meaning.
so much of what you do in Plume. You look back on those times of this sort of innocent love, but what was actually going on, and,
right.
and under the surface, or slightly under the surface. Okay,
Yeah.
here's a very practical question from Sherry regarding taking one's poetry to a new level. Few of us can luck into a wonderful Sharon or Kathleen. There are a few classes or workshops for experienced poets with some books and awards behind them. Do you have suggestions for continued learning and change beyond the poetry critique group?
Well, my first advice is always to read. Read
Yes.
and follow your own liking. Don't read something because you're supposed to. Read something because it really, you love it. And
Yes.
I think that's your best teacher always. Well, I do think there's critique groups, and then there's groups of friends that get together and talk about poetry. I think that can mean something too.
I think of Hugo House, of course, as a writing center offering this huge range of classes. Are there other, I've been away are there other places, not like Hugo House, no places quite like it, but are there other places, are there other writing centers here?
I don't know of any other writing centers here. But I think if you keep your ear to the ground, you can hear about groups of people getting together. But I think she said she didn't want maybe necessarily a critique group.
Well, I took that to mean a writing group. Maybe I'm wrong, but I took that to mean just a writing group. I want to point out that there are a lot of writers who teach privately, and I do.
Yes.
And I can point people in the direction of other writers who do. Thank you. And I can also, it depends on what level you're at. I can also, both of us can offer a lot of information about MFA programs if you're at a point where you want to do that. But you just keep seeking them out. I'm thinking about the way Kathleen, everybody finds their own way. When I started writing seriously, I sat in on workshops. I wasn't even an official student, but I sat in them, on the university where I was already.
Well, you could try what I tried too. I wrote to somebody whose book I really loved.
Exactly.
And the thing about the world of poetry, it is small. And
everybody's connected.
It's very true. And you will hear back from someone. You might not expect to hear back from a famous novelist, but you will hear back from a famous poet.
You're right.
It's kind of a cool thing.
Yes, you almost certainly will. And just keep your eye out for things, especially now. One of the pluses of COVID is that everything's on Zoom or some version of Zoom like this. And so you don't have to be where it's happening. You can find, and I've seen a lot of things a lot of classes offered on Zoom, one-time classes, weekend classes. There's just a wealth of stuff out there. Just Google it. Just look around, ask your friends, ask other writers, find writers to ask. And asking the way Kathleen did is actually the wonderful way it happened before there were any classes or MFA degrees. That, for example, Allen Ginsberg wrote to William Carlos Williams, and William Carlos Williams wrote back a lot. Yeah. And Ezra Pound wrote letters to young writers. That's how the teaching happened then, before it was formalized. Follow what you love, what you both are doing, and are looking for somebody to teach it.
That's great. Any more questions, or should we read a final
It
poem?
says one, no, but then it says no questions. So,
Okay.
oh, I have one because I think
Okay.
there's time before you read another poem. I was fascinated when we were talking a couple of days ago, and you said that you already see these poems, the poems in post-romantic, through a new lens. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, if you can imagine turning in your manuscript in, whatever, September, August of 2019, and then it's going to be published in October of 2020.
No, not
The fear of absolutely being from another world and it not having any connection at all to the world we live in now. But I've been pleasantly surprised that a lot of these poems have resonances that I had never anticipated. For instance, that poem I started with, Letter to Rilke, it's set in an election year. It's set in 2016. And so a lot of the themes in it are very much about what we're living through right this minute.
yeah.
The poem I'm going to finish with tonight talks about a nostalgia for an ordinary time, and ordinary time has never had the same meaning that it has now.
No.
And it never have we had so much nostalgia for it. So there are poems in here I would even say the poems about marriage in retrospect. I was always trying to find my original vision of this book called Post-Romantic was that there would be a line of poems about marriage and a line of poems about America, and they would intersect and bounce off of each other in this interesting way that I could never figure out how to do.
Wow.
And time
did.
Well, and time brought in all these other poems about the world, poems about other things, and so it got a little messier, a little more complicated, which is what happens when you write a poem once every 8, or poem every once every 8 years, a book every 8 years. So, it's not as clean as it was. But I think some of those poems, especially some of the marriage poems, to me almost feel like a template for trying to understand the country now. I can stand back far enough away from them and see maybe metaphors for my relationship with the America. And I think that's something maybe that doesn't happen until finally I turn in the manuscript.
Right.
And I start to step away far enough away to be able to see, what else is there.
But this is a stepping away nobody could have imagined between COVID and Black Lives Matter and the current political situation. Everybody refers to the time when you turned it in as the before times.
Yeah.
Because it feels like that. It's really interesting to me how the book resonates so much with now, because it is a kind of bridge, and it doesn't feel like something stuck in the before times at all. It feels like it's talking to the present at the same time, and
I'm glad.
That's the kind of thing poetry can do that I think is really not, a lot of stuff isn't going to make it across that divide. It's too big.
See a couple more questions.
Yep. Hi, Kathleen. What's on your current reading list?
Alice Oswald's book,
Nobody.
I just got Sam Green's book, Disturbing the Light. I'm very excited about that. I've ordered a few books that are just coming in. I have one by Crace. Is it Daniel Crace? David Crace? It's an older book that's a reprint. I have Karen Soley's new book.
Oh, great. I want to read that.
Yeah. I've been ordering books quite a bit. Earlier this summer, I was reading a lot of Audre Lorde. And it's been a busy a good time for reading.
Yeah, this is great. Now, I mean, I think in the beginning, nobody could concentrate, but then that kind of calmed down and we're just desperate for things to do.
Yeah.
Here's a question from Tree Swenson. Can you talk about changes in how you approach writing poetry from your first collection to post-romantic?
Oh, that's really interesting. So I always think of first books as really a disguised selected poems, because you just write poem after poem after poem with as when you're first writing, you have no sense of a book. You know, you're just writing a poem and then you're writing another. And then when you collect them, it's like you're taking the best of your work over some period of time. And so that book, I kind of had to impose an arc onto it. And the way is that's sort of the contemporary style, is to find an arc for the collection. And then the second book, Plume, was a project. You know, I didn't know at first that it was. I thought it was just one poem to my friend Carolyn about growing up in Richland. And then it was a few more poems about memories of growing up in Richland. And then I started doing research, and then I started trying to make sense with your help, Sharon. You kept asking me, you know, so what does it all amount to? What does it mean? So that I had to write those poems about what it meant. So that was a project and felt like a book, you know, as soon as I saw what I was at. And I thought, oh, now I've graduated to the, you know, the seniors, you know, it's like now I'll always only work in terms of a project, a book. And unfortunately, with this book, just calling it a book didn't make it a book. So part of it was writing poem by poem, and part of it was trying to see how they would all fit together.
Sorry, my computer started warning me it was about to die.
Shoot.
But it's plugged in, so, and I think it's okay now.
Okay, good.
That would be embarrassing.
We only have to make it past the finish line. We're almost there. So I would say the difference is really about thinking larger or thinking poem by poem.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Let's see.
Should we maybe have one more question, and then I'll finish with one last poem?
Here's the last one from Jacqueline. As someone on the very beginning of a long marriage journey, I'm wondering what advice you would give to your young self about romance and post-romance.
That's such a good question.
I love that.
Jacqueline, you have a great marriage ahead of you. What would I tell myself, my old self? To be more patient. I just wish I could be more mature. I had a lot of impatience, and I had a temper, and I wish I could have been a little bit more understanding. And I think I've gotten there now. I'm a very different marriage partner now than I was 30 years ago, and all to the better, I think. So I think just being patient and that would go a long way. That's what I would say for myself.
Great.
So shall I?
Yes, please.
Listen, Sharon, I can't tell you how much it's meant to me to have you here tonight. It's just nice to see your face there to talk to. Okay, and I want to thank you all so much for coming. It means a lot to me to have you here. Even though I can't see you, I know you're there, and that means everything. Okay, I'm going to finish the last poem in the book called Lilacs. And this is the one that, to me, more than anything, sort of resonates of the moment we're living in a way that I never anticipated when I wrote it. Lilacs. As though we could string pearls into a necklace of only good moments between knots of waxed string. Tonight, a month after the last lilac bloomed, I finally noticed. And no hothouse could make the bushes flower again, late, early, whatever you call the period after you've lost everything. Still, cells replicate, shed skin is replaced. We are not who we were. I'd seen the lilacs, gone through the motions of breathing in, swirled the scent in the goblet of my brain, but I wasn't listening until this evening, after the first warm day in June. when I considered how fine a bunch of lilacs would be, enough to fill my arms, to hide my face in their tender, sweet nostalgia for ordinary life. Thank you so much all for coming. I really am so grateful.
Thank you, Kathleen, for that wonderful poem to close out. And thank you, Sharon, for being here as well. And thank you all for tuning in this evening. If you enjoyed this event, you can find many more like it on our website, townhallseattle.org. We hope you'll consider making a donation, as your support will allow us to continue to provide events just like this one. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of Kathleen's book, Post-Romantic Poems, Pacific Northwest Poetry, please use the link on this live stream page to purchase through our friends at Elliott Bay Book Company. Finally, thank you again for being here. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Couldn't have done it without your help.